Welcome to our Australian Cardijn Institute webinar celebrating the birth date of Joseph Cardijn, the founder of the Young Christian Workers Movement. He was born on the 13th of November 1882, and it's given us the opportunity to launch a project we've had for some time, which we call the Cardijn Lecture. But I'd just like to start by welcoming everybody. I think we really are from at least 3 or 4 continents. The countries that I've noted so far include, as well as Australia, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Switzerland, Italy, Czechia, Czech Republic, Ireland, USA, Venezuela, and Argentina. They're the countries that I've noted from the people registered, but certainly it's an international gathering. And Tony just mentioned this before the meeting that some of you may have heard. In Australia, we have a recent tradition of acknowledging the traditional owners of our country. So I'll begin with that. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and other nations. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation and of all Indigenous peoples around the world. And I'd just like to also open with a small prayer. In Australia, we're in the middle of the Australian Plenary Council, the first Plenary Council since 1937. So I'll just read that and you can follow it on the screen. Come, Holy Spirit of Pentecost. Come, Holy Spirit of the Great Southland. O God, bless and unite all your people in Australia and the world, and guide us on the pilgrim way of the Plenary Council. Give us the grace to see your face in one another and to recognise Jesus, our companion on the road. Give us the courage to tell our stories, to speak boldly of your truth. Give us ears to listen humbly to each other and a discerning heart to hear what you are saying. Lead your church into a hope-filled future that we may live the joy of the gospel through Jesus Christ our Lord, bread for the journey from age to age. Amen. Our Lady, Help of Christians, pray for us. St. Mary MacKillop, pray for us. So yeah, I think the whole spirit of Pentecost is very important, not just for the Plenary Council, but Pope John the 23rd, I always remember this, was his great hope was that Vatican II would lead to a new Pentecost in the church. So I guess in a way, our work on synodality is part of that work of developing that new Pentecost in the church and in the world today. Now, before we go on to the content of the day, I'd just like to hand over to Tony, who's our self-styled Zoomologist, to just give you a couple of practical points for the session.
Thanks, Stefan, and hello everybody, and welcome to our session today. So, the emergence of synodality, the Latin American experience, and just a few tips and tricks for those that may be new to Zoom and those who are regular. For best viewing, you might like to choose the speaker mode, and you can do that at the top. If you're using a desktop or computer, at the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's a few dots with the word view. You can select the speaker, which will enable you to have the speaker as the main focus for your viewing. This meeting is being recorded. If you do not wish your image to be shown, please disable your camera. All participants except panel members will be muted for the main presentations. There will be an opportunity to engage in conversation later on in the session. We do have a large number of participants, so we need to be able to manage opportunities for that. I'd ask you to try and restrict the use of the chat box during presentations, as it can be quite distracting having the chat box pop up. There will be a time for reflection following our presentations where you'll be able to pop your questions into the chat box. So try and hold them until the speakers have finished and we have a time of reflection. during the session, if you have any technical issues, pop a message in that chat box and I will be following that through today. So let's go. I hope that helps everyone participate, and back to you, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Tony. So just to say a few more words on why we, the Australian Cardijn Institute, decided to inaugurate the Cardijn Lecture. I think many of you are familiar with Joseph Cardijn as the founder of the Young Christian Workers Movement, the Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne in Belgium at the start of the 20th century, which became the inspiration for a whole series of other movements, Young Christian Students, Christian Worker Movement, more generally known as the Specialized Catholic Action Movements at that time. And of course, many of us are very familiar, especially today, with his famous CJAC method enshrined in Pope John XXIII's Mater and Magistra, and later used as the drafting method for Gaudium and Spes at Vatican II, and since then in many encyclicals, including more recently by Pope Francis. The third thing, which is probably less known about Cardijn and which is very relevant to today's session, is Cardijn's concept of a lay clerical partnership. In fact, he didn't say very often in public, but his idea was a lay-led church. Sometimes it got him in trouble. And we can see what that meant to him in many of his famous phrases. Everything by the young workers, but nothing without the priest. And he was very harsh on priests who didn't work with lay people. Woe to the priest who works alone was one of his famous sayings, borrowed from a passage in Ecclesiastes. But he also took that more recent thing from the church fathers. The priest is everything and nothing in the movement. So these are ideas which, looking back, we can see as a precursor to what today we might call synodality. And it's part of the reason why we also, as the Australian Cardijn Institute, have been looking into how to develop a synodal church in more recent times. So this is why we're really privileged today to have with us three great speakers: Rafael Luciani, who some of you have met before in the chat just before we started, an expert in the Theological Commission for the Synod of Bishops. He's been very busy the last few weeks over in Rome, working precisely on preparing that next synod on synodality, as it's become known. But also he's worked very closely with the Latin American bishops and the Confederation of Religious Men and Women in Latin America. And that's all apart from his work as a professor at Andres Bello University in Caracas, Venezuela, his hometown, and also at Boston College in the US. And joining Rafael today, we have Elissa from Melbourne. We're very fortunate. I was very fortunate to make contact with Elissa recently, learning that she's just recently completed her PhD on synodality and authenticity towards a contemporary ecclesiology for the Catholic Church. And our third respondent will be Nancy Conrad, who's just joined us from Baltimore, USA. She was, in fact, the vice president of the US Young Christian Workers back in 1961. She took part in the Second International Council of the YCW in Rio de Janeiro, which just finished exactly 60 years ago this week. And she knew Cardijn personally. And so she'll also be responding from her experience. And today also she belongs and she's been a promoter of the US Cardijn Associates Network. So this is the introduction to our speakers today, but I don't wish to go on any further. I think our speakers have plenty to say. So now I'd like to hand over to Rafael, who's going to share his experience and his knowledge on the theme, the emergence of synodality, the Latin American experience.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and I'm really honored and happy to be here with you all. And I just want to share some ideas and reflections also coming from the Latin American experience and the expectation that we all have on this synod on synodality. Let me share with you the presentation. So a first idea that I want to share is why, at least from Latin America, do we see the need of this synod on synodality, as we are thriving through a crisis, as we all know, of an institutional model that needs to be transformed. So one of the inspirations I think that we have is the understanding of Conrad's way in which Christianity was to be seen as a whole, and therefore when we talk about a crisis, it's not a crisis about one specific thing, but about the whole that becomes as an institutional model in crisis. In these regards, Francis says that clericalism is the real perversion in the church, because it is what shapes the institutional model that we have nowadays. The Chilean Latin American theologian Ronaldo Muñoz, already in the 70s, had said that the clerical institutional structure is one of the great structural obstacles to the discovery of the gospel. He was the first ecclesiologist, and very few until today in Latin America, that was aware of the need of the reform of the structures, and not only of a conversion of the mentalities at that time. And we have also learned in Latin America from the report done in Australia, and we also understand that the problem is a systemic one. So we cannot approach what we're living now in the church as a problem of one local church or some local churches, but as an interconnection of the universal churches. We find that we're facing a truly institutional failure of the model that we have been living in the church. One of the reasons, as we all know from the Australian report, is the notion and the exercise of power. As we have to overcome this sacred notion of power that is related to the idea of the ontological change in ordination. And one of the key elements in Latin American theology of ministries, for example, is to understand that ordained ministry is a service, and this service is functional, and it's in a time, in a history, in a context. So therefore the community should be the subject of any activity of the church. But we have also the experience, especially in the diocesan church, of a clericalist formation in seminaries, as we also have in the religious life a more social political engagement of ministerial life. So in this context, Francis has taken one of the elements that we reflect a lot in the Latin American context. How can we understand today ministry without understanding that it is a chosen person as an individual that is called by God, and therefore has a authority already granted because of the ordination. One of the elements that we are trying to do in Latin America is how to develop a theology of ministries, especially of ordained ministries, that aligns with this notion of synodality, as we will see further, especially as part of the people of God. Clericalism is a hierarchical authoritarian system that embodies the whole structure of the church. One of the elements that really worries us is the topic of the formation in seminaries. There are now two processes in Latin America trying to deal with this, one in Venezuela, in my country, and the other one in Peru, but in Lima, in the Archbishop of Lima. they are in the two, these places, they are trying, the church, to try to discern how can they propose a new model of seminaries and a new model of parishes, because that's where we find that clericalism has not only its roots, but it extends to the society. So the element of discernment when coming to sacred power is how do we understand our role as people of God, as faithful all together and not as separately individuals and subjects in the church. So we're challenged to reform attitudes, behaviors, but also institutional models in the church. So to convert and to reform the church for us have been a call that we find its source in Paul VI, that is a very important pontificate for Latin America, because when he went to Bogota to accompany the bishops that were going to open the conference of Medellin, he brought the fruits of Populorum Progressio that were received by the bishops in Medellin, and the conclusion of Medellin was received by Pope Paul VI in his Evangelii Nunciandi, where he uses for the first time the word liberation. So what do we see in Pope Paul VI's call to find a more complete definition of the church, a call that today can be seen as a way to embrace synodality. We are betting in this context for a process that needs to reconnect with the Second Vatican Council call for a continual reform. In Latin America, the whole continent has been always a very active church receiving the Second Vatican Council. Something that it's always admires me is that in our seminaries and faculties of theology, key courses around the Second Vatican Council are very important. Therefore, when we approach the topic of reform of the church, we try to connect with the call of Unitatis Redintegratio that is received by Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, and calls us not only for a conversion, but for a reform of the church. Conrad can help us to see this path towards a reform that needs to be seen in both directions, a spiritual and a structural at the same time. One of our also worries in Latin America is that we need to move forward towards a more structural reform and not only a spiritual conversion in the church. It is not enough to maintain what has existed until now. It says Conrad, adapting it, for example, it is necessary to build again. In 1955, the CELAM, the Latin American Episcopal Council, was created, a new structure. But after the council, that was a structure that permitted the Latin American church to create and recreate a new way of being church. So we understand that there are times where we can renew what we have, but there are times where we need to create new structures that we need in order to respond to the signs of the time. Recovering the text and the spirit of the Second Vatican Council has been the element that characterizes the way in which we approach to ecclesiology in Latin America. That's why the Lumen Gentium chapter 2, which is now in synodality, the key criterion to understand it, is in Latin America the way in which we received the Second Vatican Council, the church as people of God. Cardinal Suenen's words resound in our ecclesial history as he understood the church as a whole, as the people of God, that he said in 1970 in this text, and then with the hierarchy at the service to these people. This Copernican turn, as he called it, this Copernican revolution that has still today the consequences not yet finished measuring. This is something that we believe truly. We are still in an ongoing process of reception of this ecclesiology of the people of God, and the consequences of this ecclesiology still have not yet been assimilated in the reception of the council worldwide. In the context of Latin America, we had a first reception in the social political aspects. Now we're trying to do a reception in the structural aspects of the church. The International Theological Commission says that the chapter 2, People of God of Lumen Gentium, is the central criterion to interpret the whole ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council. As we are 3 members in the Latin American Commission for the Synod, Father Carlos Maria Gali from Argentina, Agenor Brigenti from Brazil, and myself from Venezuela. And we, the 3 of us, truly believe that in this moment of the church, the understanding of this second chapter of Lumen Gentium is a new re-articulation of the whole interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. What happened, for example, in 1985 with this extraordinary synod was also a re-articulation of the hermeneutics of the council. Now, with Pope Francis, and especially in this synod on synodality, we are seeing that the re-articulation of a new hermeneutical approach to the council is being taking place. The church as people of God should be understood as an organic reality, and Cardinal Suenens can help us to understand this when he said the people of God as a whole, as a totality, and as a totality, it has consequently a corresponsibility that derives from each of the members. So we have here a way in which we can understand that as a whole, as a totality, we understand our identity as a church, but in the relationships in which corresponsibility is the way in which we should relate to each other as members of the church. Lumen Gentium 32 is a key text in these regards because it establishes that the relationship among ecclesial subjects, it is from a mutual need context. We need is not we help, we need each other in order to complete each other's vocation and realization of the vocation. Suenens spoke about this multi-network of structural ties and vital relationships. This way of understanding an organic life interconnected, as we call people of God, as we say church. Reconfiguring ecclesial identities is one of the keys of synodalities, which we find the source in the debates of the council when the famous pyramid model was inverted. The key word was Christi Fidelis, faithful. All ecclesial identities, lay, religious, presbyters, bishops, the Pope, as they are considered faithful in equal rights due to the baptism and the participation of the priesthood of the people, then we can understand these horizontal relationships. This is interesting because in Latin America, we do have clericalism, but it is not a clericalism grounded at the level of this notion of sacredness or due to ordination. It is more a clericalism in liturgical life. But in pastoral life, you have a very horizontal church. So this principle of understanding each other as faithful pastorally was received in Latin America, though liturgically still is a problem because we deal with clericalism, especially in that regards. Another element of synodality is that it helps to reconfigure relationships and communicative dynamics. This means that centering the ecclesiology on chapter 2 of Lumen Gentium helps to place the hierarchy within the people of God and as one faithful more in the whole community of the people of God. This implies then a reconfiguration again of the way in which we understand ourselves in the church. How can we discern the church in a synodal key? First of all, the Pope's speech during the 50th commemoration anniversary of the establishment of the Synod of Bishops has been his most important ecclesiological speech. And when he spoke there about the church of the third millennium, this expression, the third millennium, meant the search to look for a new institutional model. That of the second millennium, which was a homogenizing, a more uniformizing model. The first millennium, which was characterized by diversity and in terms not only of theology, but also in liturgy and in the way in which communities were built. The third millennium is called now to look for a new institutional model. If synodality, as it is said by the International Theological Commission, is a constitutive dimension of the church, and that means it defines what church means. This synod is about the church, not about a topic of the church, like former synods on the youth, on the family, on the Amazon. This is a synod on the church. Therefore, the third millennium is a challenge in regards of searching a new institutional model, a new ecclesial way of proceeding, which should embrace a reform of mentalities and a reform of the structures. One of the characteristics of synodality is that the scope of all the communicative dynamics in the church are focused on decision making. In the International Theological Commission, we find this beautiful text. We're called as a whole community in our diversity to live these communicative dynamics, pray, listen, analyze, dialogue, and advise. But all these dynamics has one and only scope in a synodal church, that we all make pastoral decisions, Therefore, when we speak about the participatory church, a co-responsible church, that means how to articulate this participation of all of us, but according to the vocation of each one of us. In this context, we have now the task of how to understand that listening should be not only reciprocal, but binding. Binding, and that means to ask ourselves which are the mediations that we are using to listen the people. We have done right now a process in Latin America that will have its end at the end of this month. It's called the Ecclesial Assembly of Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a new structure created in order to have a synodal way of proceeding with only 20% of bishops. And one of the biggest exercises was the exercise of consulting and listening over 70,000 people in less than 1 year. And the mediations, that means a question that we need to raise in a synodal church, because the confrontation of points of view is something that should characterize the listening of a synodal church, not simply the mediation through the gospel, prayer, rereading of life, as Alphonse Borras, the canonist, well exposes, but also the confrontation of points of view. In a synodal church, the reciprocal listening means also the listening of that I don't want to listen, and that I need to listen, the cry of the other. The model that you will find in the preparatory document of the Synod, and that it's very important for us in Latin America, is the model of Saint Cyprian. How do we combine taking advice and building consensus in the church? Because Saint Cyprian said that he did nothing without the advice of the presbyters, but then he had to build the consensus of the people. So without the consensus of the people, even having the advice of the presbyters, he would not take a decision. Here we find a model of what synodality can be today. It's interesting that in the speech of Cardinal Lecture during the inauguration of the Synod, the 9th of October, he said at the end an open question. After having the final document being approved by the Synodal Fathers, then go back to the dioceses and get the consensus of the local churches, and then return to the Pope. So it is part of this new culture that we have to discern and we have to create for the third millennium, how to build consensus as a key element in a synodal church. And to build consensus, it's important that we link the decision-making and the decision-taking processes in the church. We have this, as I said, the big listening process in Latin America that led to what we call a discernment document. We don't call it anymore a final document or a working document. It's now being called a discernment document. And that discernment document is a fruit of the decision-making of all, including the bishops, and also social movements that do not belong to the church. And this is a new way of proceeding, which is interesting because then the decision-taking process that will take place in the coming weeks, those who will take the final decision have already participated in the process of the elaboration of the decision. So the sensus fidei, as the International Theological Commission says, of all of us, the discernment exercise at various levels and the decision of the authority come together in this circularity. It's interesting that in the new way in which we are figuring out how to proceed as a synodal church, we just did a reform of the Latin American Episcopal Council. And the key element was the organizational reform. And we have a way in which governance is diversified and decentralized in a way that decisions are built when they get to the top, to the presidency of the CELAM, the presidency of CELAM has participated throughout the process. So one of the tasks and the challenges was that how not to isolate anymore those who take decisions in the church, but to integrate us as a whole. One of the challenges that we have now after the Ecclesial Assembly in this month is how to form synodal attitudes. And we understand that without reforming seminaries, without reforming Pensa in faculties of theology, this will not be possible, a synodal church. We can quote here Routier, who says very clearly that sometimes these attitudes basically depend on the relational skills of those in office and on the ability to situate themselves as brothers, friends, collaborators, cooperators. But this needs to be formed. We don't naturally learn how to dialogue, how to discern, how to become friends. So this is a new culture that needs to be changed from seminaries and faculties of theology on. The Latin American path towards a synodal church has been a very beautiful, interesting, and path that we have been from 1955 until today living with a lot of changes. The interesting thing is that we start from praxis, and then comes the theologizing of that was born from a praxis. For example, in 1955, when the Latin American Episcopal Council was created, it was a council to collaborate, to help, to build a joint pastoral plan among the local churches in the continent. But when the Second Vatican II was celebrated, CELAM became a collegial, a permanent collegial structure, which helped to embrace the local church's ecclesiology. So the praxis that was first established helped, after the council, the theology of the local churches that came after the council. In 2018, CELAM entered a process of restructuring. Before, it was only an episcopal body carried out by bishops, and all decisions were taken by bishops. In the reform, for 3 years, we worked not only with ecclesial institutions, but also with a consulting auditing firm. And right now, the structures, the decisions, and the organizational culture has been implemented in a way that collegiality is moving towards a new praxis within the framework of synodality. It is the first experience of renewing collegiality in a synodal key, in a structure, not simply in relationships, but in a proper ecclesial structures. The second most recent experience is the creation of the Ecclesial Conference of the Amazon. The interesting thing is that it is not a bishops' conference. We decided to call it Ecclesial Conference because it brings together not only laity and bishops, but also a variety of institutions and people that come together in the same table where they have to discern and make the decisions. So when the presidency of SEAMA is going to take the final decision, that president is sitting with the rest doing the elaboration of the decision. It's a new way of power sharing conception of the church that is emerging from this ecclesial and episcopal co-governance praxis that has been implemented. It's something that it's been in a new process of praxis, and it is evolving. If we see the history of the Latin American church, we have had 5 Episcopal conferences, and for us, those are the channels where the church reflects the reception of the council in each time. Our source conference is Medellin in 1968. Pope Francis's source conference is Aparecida in 2007. In those conferences, the church has embraced and enhanced affective collegiality in Latin America. But now, the newness, the novelty is that we are renewing with this first ecclesial assembly, decided not to be an Episcopal conference anymore, that will be held in November, renewing collegiality through a synodal way of understanding the decision-making and taking in the church. This is a challenge now. We are in an ongoing reception of this specific number of Aparecida. The laity should participate in the discernment, decision-taking, planning, and execution. In the Spanish text, I put it there because in the translations, sometimes have been used the word decision-making. The bishops in Latin America said the decision-taking should be made by the laity in the participation of these ecclesial structures. So this is a specific number in which we are now in the process of reception and discernment as a church. The Latin American ecclesiologist Muñoz in the 70s gave us this shape to end of this church that we are trying to envision with this new ecclesial assembly. A community of men and women who are open and free, who cooperate responsibly, living in an attitude of permanent self-criticism and search, in which all participate actively and in solidarity. At all levels, there should be structures of participation for lay people, religious priests, and the possibility of electing representatives and leaders. The hierarchy must consult the laity for its pastoral decisions or its declarations. It's interesting because we were influenced, as you know, by Cardijn's methods, and from there, the Latin American method was born. We say always, we Latin Americanize Cardijn's method, because the way in which we approach the See Judge Act was precisely the way in which Cardijn envisioned, but then, I'm referring because this is the line very interesting, bishops started to use Catholic action groups to write their own pastoral exhortations in the dioceses, because the consultation done through the youth Catholic action youth groups were feeding the documents that the bishops were writing, for example, in the 50s, in the 60s, and in the 70s. So when Ronaldo writes this, the hierarchy must consult the laity, he's writing that from this experience of having bishops in Latin America working with young youth laity movements from Catholic actions, providing this way of approaching society through consultation, through polls, and through a dialogue. And finally, the appointment of bishops, which is one of the challenges and tasks that one of the groups in the Theological Commission of the Synod is working right now, how to envision a new way of appointing bishops where the community should participate and be a subject of the whole process. So we think, and we are really in the belief that this synod for us, as we see it, is the reconfiguration or the possibility of reconfiguring the hermeneutics of the Second Vatican Council from chapter 2, Church People of God of Lumen Gentium. And this implies that the embracement of the church as a totality should lead us to a reform not only of in a spiritual character, but the reform of the structures. The challenge is that we still need to move forward in a theology of ministry, because without the reform of the theology of the ordained ministry, we think that we will not advance much further. So a task of reforming the theology of the ordained ministry and then creating new structures that could embody a ecclesial way of understanding the church and not an episcopal or only a collegial way of understanding the decision taken in the church. But thank you so much. This is very fast, but I will share with you the PowerPoint and leave it with you and an article that I wrote with all this information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. That's fantastic. Yeah, wow. I think we've got, I don't know, months, years of work to implement some of those ideas that you're working on in Latin America, and it's really given, at least personally speaking. But now we're going to move straight across to Elissa Roper, who, as I mentioned earlier, has just completed her PhD thesis on synodality. So I think she's a really appropriate person to take up some of the points that Rafael's made.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Professor Rafael. I'd first like to acknowledge that I live and work on the land of the Wurundjeri clan. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I grieve for their suffering and commit to justice. I acknowledge also that when we gather as Catholics and as Christians, there's many who are not at the table and many whose voices are not heard. I acknowledge those people who have experienced a betrayal of trust, and I pray for God's Spirit to be amongst us today. So thank you, Professor Luciani. Today has been a wonderful opportunity for us in Australia to hear some of the journey of the Church in Latin America, a really vigorous and comprehensive journey that I think reveals a lot to us of our own journey and where we are perhaps in our progress. So the journey in Latin America of receiving Vatican II, particularly through the concept of the people of God and through those concepts in the second chapter of Lumen Gentium, of the embracing of the need for spiritual conversion in a really strong and urgent way, and of structural reform, of perceiving the church as an organic whole, and as Cardinal Lecture says, a totality with co-responsibility amongst its members. And the mutual need that we have from Lumen Gentium 32 as shaping our ecclesial identity and placing the hierarchy within the people of God. So it's clear that the Latin American experience of synodality comes from a profound recognition of the current era as a kairos of hope. And I took that phrase from the wonderful webpage that describes that new ecclesial body, the Ecclesial Conference of Latin America and the Caribbean, a kairos of hope. So it's been a long journey from Medellin, Puebla, and Aparecida to the bodies of Selam and Repam and the others that we were shown, and through to the current era of our Pope of Evangeligarium and Querida Amazonia in particular, and the remarkable Cardijn Sea Judge Act structure of the preparatory document for that synod on the Amazon. There's a powerful breaking through of hope in that journey and a birthing of new ecclesial life. There's an achievement of consensus that the path of synodality is indeed the path that God expects of the church in the third millennium. And I really admire the commitment to that consensus. Now, today I'm responding on the topic of the experience of synodality of the church in Australia. And I've chosen to describe our experience today in Australia as Catholics as baptismal. we have experienced death, and we are being painfully born again. Now, what is dying is the concept of the church as a perfect society, as triumphant, juridical, secure. Pope Pius X described the church's identity as that of two categories of person. And he says, so distinct are these categories that with the pastoral body, the bishops or the hierarchy is that term, only rests the necessary right and authority for promoting the end of that society and directing all its members towards the end. The one duty of the multitude is to allow themselves to be led, and like a docile flock, to follow the pastors. Now, this describes the hierarchical paradigm of the Catholic Church. It's the clericalist model that Rafael spoke of. It is this inadequate self-understanding that is dying. The hierarchical paradigm is founded on the twin supports of clericalism and patriarchalism, which mistake childish obedience for the rigours of Christian discipleship and prefer to build walls instead of bridges. So it's not the various roles of priest, bishop, and lay that are defective in themselves, but the lens through which those relationships are perceived. So let's look closer at this experience in Australia in three areas: governance, praxis, and theology. And after each example, I'll give the question given to us by the Plenary Council. What do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? This question provides a pivot point to move from the experience of dying to perceiving the shoots of fierce and humble hope as our experience of new life in synodality. So area one, the failure of the hierarchical paradigm of governance and leadership. The final report of the Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse states, we have concluded that there were catastrophic failures of leadership of the Catholic Church authorities over many decades, particularly before the 1990s. Those failures led to the suffering of a great number of children, their families, and wider communities. For many, the harm was irreparable. In numerous cases, that harm could have been avoided had Catholic Church authorities acted in the interests of children rather than their own interests. Survivors were often disbelieved, ignored, or punished, and in some cases were further abused. And so the body of Christ in Australia, as it is in so many parts of the world, is so deeply broken and traumatised. What do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? In 2018, a year after the Royal Commission concluded, Australian theologian Richard Lennon addressed the Conference on Health and Integrity. He pointed to this time, this kairos, as fundamentally one of conversion for the Church in Australia, time for a change of heart and a corresponding embodied change in our acting, that reform that Rafael spoke of. The hierarchical model of governance has resisted conversion for so long that it is calcified. Rigid and hard, it could resist the cries of the people of God, lay, religious, and clergy alike, and refuse them the fullness of their baptismal identity. So conversion for the Church in Australia, therefore, is a moment of breaking, of giving up that which needs to die, as we do in baptism. We're at the threshold of new life, of a commitment to synodality, which the Church in Latin America has already entered into. I have two examples of the Australian experience of a synodal new life in the area of governance and leadership. First is the significant work done to enter into the work of the Royal Commission and to allow it to shine a light on that which needs to be transformed. The Health and Integrity in Church and Ministry Conference is one such effort. Another is the Light from the Southern Cross report. Produced in 2020, it contains 86 recommendations on the governance of dioceses and parishes in Australia. If the Church were to prioritise engagement with this document, such as bringing it into dialogue with the plenary council process, then much could be achieved towards the fruits of good governance, co-responsibility, accountability, transparency, and inclusivity. The second example is that of the plenary council for the Church in Australia. It is still unfolding, of course, and opportunities have been missed, but it is the first significant attempt by the Catholic Church in Australia to listen on a huge scale, and perhaps to learn and to change. Now, whenever I feel frustrated or concerned about progress, I recall the words of Noel Connolly, a Columban priest dearly departed, who gave his energy to the early dreams of council preparation. He spoke of the challenge of breaking open synodality in our post-hierarchical context. And he said, "As we prepare, we are being encouraged to speak boldly and share what is in our hearts. One of my concerns is that I do not think it is easy to know what is deep in our hearts, and it's even more difficult to express it adequately. Speaking is an art, and it's only learnt with practice." The Council alone can't satisfy our dreams of good governance and nourishing relationships and healthy theology. Our institutional synods and councils are all part of a bigger ecclesial and deeply historical process of conversion and consensus. Perhaps with this spirit stirring, we may come to the conclusion, like the Church in Latin America, that we need our institutional bodies to promote synodality in Australia. So area 2 is the inadequacy of hierarchical praxis. Now, increasingly, Australian Catholics are becoming aware of how the hierarchical vision of the Church, divided between those who govern, rule and lead, and those who follow with docility, has shaped not only the governance, but the praxis or established practice and habits of the Church. The following example demonstrates how the Church's hierarchical praxis is not adequate to support the people of God in today's world in two ways. Internally, in how we are sustained together as a mature, responsible communities of faith, and externally, our missionary life in, with, and for the world. Now, these are the words of a young woman named Elizabeth. She says, "One thing we can do is look at what is already happening. Yes, there are priests ministering in and with traditional Aboriginal communities. Yes, there are deacons serving as armed forces chaplains. Yes, there are consecrated people volunteering to lead liturgies in nursing homes and homeless shelters. Yes, there are lay liturgical ministers who preside and preach in prisons, hospitals, and many other places. They reach out with pastoral and liturgical skill to those with intellectual disabilities from various cultures, the deaf community, Rainbow Catholic support groups, youth groups, remote and isolated people. They form relationships from which liturgy arises, not only fly in as sacramental contractors. All of these ministries are possible under current church law. All of these people may be trained, formed, qualified, and tested by the Holy Spirit and the community. Some feel called to dedicate their whole lives to this ministry. But only bishops, priests, and deacons are ordinary ministers of baptism, distribution of communion and exposition, can witness marriages and give homilies. The others are technically filling in, taking up the slack, exceptions, the last resort. They are understudies, but not the cast. And therefore, only the ordained are truly and officially sent for proclamation. What do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? Elizabeth's words speak to the experience of many Australian Catholics whose full-hearted response to their vocation's call is accompanied by feelings of confusion, frustration, humiliation, and even resentment. I grieve at the loss the church in Australia has sustained, the subdued lights, the rejected gifts. But the shoots of hope lie here. Australian Catholics have seen and felt the failure of hierarchical vision of being church. They've discerned that the future deserves a full, mature, and effective sacramental life, a life of joy and friendship that deepens our shared baptismal identity and missionary discipleship. Many Australian groups are advocating for a renewal, and I have a long list here that I've included in a reference document that will be emailed with the link to this recording. They give me hope, and for many people, also a sense of belonging, acceptance, and empowerment. Now, we've surveyed the Australian experience of the death of the hierarchical vision of governance and leadership and hierarchical praxis. We'll move now to the need for the birth of synodal theology. 2 years ago, at a conference called Voices of Challenge at Yarra Theological Union, in a small group discussing the need for ecclesial renewal, a man threw up his hands in the air and said in a disgusted voice, "Theology is to blame for all of this." And the others all nodded. Perhaps they had heard echoes of Pope Pius X when what they needed was something meaningful for today. What do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? In my journey as a theologian, I discern that God is asking us to bring our religion alive by taking our theology deep within the contemporary Australian experience. To ensure that our theology resonates with synodality and engages and fosters our open hearts and minds, deliberately avoiding restricting and excluding. To be well communicated and well connected where we are, and thus support our outgoing redeeming work in and with society. And to remind the people of God that it is baptismal identity, not ordination, that calls forth Christian agency, communion, authority, responsibility, and mission. To support the formation of all the baptised in and through their daily lives, and assist them to transform the world. Indeed, the purpose of Joseph Cardine's See, Judge, Act. To take up such a method that promotes dialogue, creativity and imagination, communal discernment, deeper spirituality, and friendship. And in conclusion, with the example of the church in Latin America, shared with us today by Professor Rafael, we too may perceive this time as a kairos of hope, and making that context for our governance and leadership, praxis and theology. That we may practice reciprocal listening, binding listening with each other, with our joys and sufferings and with the problems of our environment. To build a consensus, the golden rule of Cyprian, through having synodality permeate all that we are and do, a process of the sensus fidei and an exercise in discernment. To allow the Spirit to transform us into a people of overflowing generosity and inclusivity, and at the same time to vigorously pursue integrated decision-taking and structural reform. In the words that Rafael shared, a community of people who are open and free, who cooperate responsibly. I love that phrase and I'll take that with me. A community of people who are open and free, who cooperate responsibly. So thank you for listening to me. And on your behalf, I offer grateful thanks again to Professor Rafael and to Stefan and the Australian Cardijn Institute for hosting us today. Thank you.
Well, I'd also like to thank you. That was just an incredible reception, let's say, of Rafael's presentation and an application of it to our Australian context here. And I'm very sure many people would like to take up further points, but so I'll move quickly to Nancy. I cannot see on the screen Nancy, but I hope you're there among our participants. As I mentioned, Nancy is from Baltimore in the US, had a long lifetime experience, not just with the Cardijn movements, but in community work in the USA. Over to you, Nancy. Nancy, I believe you're on mute. You're on mute, Nancy. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay. We'll start again.
Sorry about that.
Right. Thank you, though, Stefan, for inviting me just to say a few words, and that's what I promised to do. But I do want to say that you do give us hope, Rafael, especially with the story of the process in Latin America and where we might be as a church one of these days is really very inspiring. And also, Elissa, with the promise that you're putting forth with the experience in Australia. Unfortunately, well, I do want to say, first of all, we are here because it's Cardijn's birthday, and happy birthday, Cardijn, because actually so much of what we're talking about when we talk about synodality, I think those of us who were members of the Young Christian Workers and followers of the Cardijn methodology realized that probably we understood synodality before we knew what the word was, before we'd ever really heard the word. But now we're learning about synodality and wondering why everyone's not talking about it, because this is the way that Cardijn sort of encouraged all of us to live. And I think that is what many of us, once we got into the process of See, Judge, Act, of the formation that we were given in the movement, we realized that it is a process that of cooperation with one another, lay people in our small groups, with chaplains, and sometimes even with bishops. But we've always had, since Vatican II, with all the great hopes that came from Vatican II, I think so many of us who were part of the movement have felt the frustration that why can't we get through the door? Why can't we talk with the bishops? And there are some we can talk to, but most of the time the doors seem like they're closed. It sounds as if Australia is moving along much faster than we are in the United States. We do know that there are some bishops who seem to be on the ball when it comes to starting the process of synodality. I think very often what we're hearing is, well, have a little group meet and tell us what the people said and send us your reports. And I know in my diocese, although there's been an extension for when reports can be sent in to the bishops, we were told, try to get them in earlier. We don't want to wait that long, but if you have to wait, let us know ahead of time. For most of us, I think we're looking forward to a process where we can continue to meet with one another and at a certain point send in what we've been hearing so that everyone's voice can be heard and that we can understand one another by actually exchanging thoughts and ideas. Once we listen and react, we all become a little different as we are formed by another. And that was one of the things that Cardijn kept stressing, formation, formation. So, I don't want to hold things up because I know everyone had lots of questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of the questions too. We in the United States, I think, are probably a bit behind the rest of the world when it comes to beginning the process of synodality. We haven't heard a great deal. There has been an opening. We were pleased to hear Cardinal Lecture when he had his opening mass, and the last statement he said was that the Holy Father is encouraging the whole world to follow the example of Cardinal Cardijn as he encouraged members of the Young Christian Workers to work in small groups, to see, judge, act together, and to be formed with their clergy and partners with their church. So I think we are at a time where maybe we do have to die, and maybe die a lot, to get rid of some of the baggage that we've been carrying. But after many years, you know, as a YCW member, you never can lose that. I suddenly feel like we're at a time that maybe with the synodality process and the call from Pope Francis, especially with the title of his book telling us, let us dream, we can dream of a new way of being church. And it sounds like Latin America is helping to lead the way, and Australia is a little bit ahead of us. So we will learn in the United States from all of you, I'm sure. And we'll come together and talk with one another and possibly all grow together into a new church, and one that is really Christian and open and free, where we can all aspire to our fullest potential with dignity for everyone, and live in the way that our God meant us to live. So thank you for putting this together, Stefan, and for inviting us from all over the world.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy. Yes, great the way you connected all those different elements of the Cardijn tradition with synodality and the challenges that we're facing today. So yeah, now it is time for others to join in. And Tony, I think you are going to facilitate the questions for us. Can I hand over to you?
Yes, okay. Thanks, Stefan. What I'd like to invite everyone to do is to take a couple of minutes to reflect. We've had some incredible input, some stimulating suggestions, and wonderful metaphors to work with. Let's take a couple of minutes to let everything sink in. Invite you to use this opportunity to take a stretch. We've been sitting and listening hard. Let your body freshen up as well. We'll put a couple of minutes into the reflection. During that time, I invite you to put your questions or reflections into the chat room. We have 86, 87 participants here, so there's a lot more people than we can probably accommodate for conversation at this stage, but this is only the beginning of a process here. So let's take a couple of minutes to reflect and post our reflections and questions into the chat box, and we'll rejoin in a couple of minutes. Give yourselves a chance to stand up and give the body a bit of a stretch as well. Welcome back and thank you. A significant part of the Cardijn methodology is that second step, judge, discern. And that's what this moment is about. So we have a large number of participants, so a couple of comments have started to come through on the chat box. Let's just have a couple of looks at, just run through them. First observation about the audience, a very different audience from the one, there was a meeting in the Sydney Diocese listening to Bishop Barron, asking them to go into battle. The comments is, I'm so pleased to hear of the South American process and wondered how it relates to the huge disaffiliation of members and movement towards Pentecostalism. in South America, in Latin America. Rafael, would you like to address that? That transition that we often hear about in our media from Catholicism to the more evangelical Pentecostal experience of faith. And I don't know, Elissa might even like to comment. I'm in an archdiocese where a lot of the structure is now supported and managed by a Catholic charismatic covenant community. So Rafael, would you like to respond to that comment?
Yes, throughout the 80s, end of the 80s, and as we know, the 90s, most of our bishops were changed, and the new appointments had a more hierarchical clericalist profile. Throughout 20 years, the diocesan church, not the religious orders, but the diocesan church started a process of centering itself only around cult and liturgy. The religious life, religious congregations did an option, according to Medellin and then Puebla, to engage in social, political, and economic pastoral activities. No? And this created a two-layer church, to say kind of a metaphor. No? And if you see those years, you start to see evangelical, especially Pentecostalist group growing, but it depends on each country. For example, Brazil is a case where almost half of the countries almost reaching the point of non-Catholics. But you have also from long time, not from now, Uruguay, which is the most secularized country with 80% or more of people that are not Catholic. So we cannot generalize the whole Latin American continent as 100% Catholics always, no? But the religious order did an option to incarnate themselves, insert themselves in the poor places of each country. And the model of small communities began to arise, especially throughout the 70s and 80s. And again, after the 85, we began a huge process of reconfiguring during the pontificate of John Paul II. With Francis, the situation has changed in the way that you do not see now this opposition so strictly, boldly found between the religious orders and the diocesan life. In fact, to put an example, we had in Venezuela the plenary council in the end of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s, and the whole confederation of religious plus the bishops and the laity movements came together in a way in which they had to vote all together until the last decision that was taken in the council through 10 years. Right now, Argentina has a archdiocesan synod in process, and so other diocesan churches. So now it's reshaping again. This is something that is right now an ongoing also process. So yes, it depends on each country, in each process, but we were really affected throughout 20 years of changing the profile of bishops. And this is why Chile, if you want a reason why Chile exploded, is precisely because the intervention of Rome in the Chilean bishops, which was the more progressive church in Latin America, was strictly and directly a policy throughout the end of the 80s. And because of that, the whole profile of the church, the whole face of the church in Chile changed. Because the society became more secularized, you did not have a Catholic contention wall in media, for example, and it exploded and that's why we have now the Chilean crisis known. It was there, but known publicly, no? So yes, we have been affected, and now I think we are trying to reconfigure. It's the first time again that Selam Clar, the religious orders, are working together. They didn't sit together for so many years until Francis came. It's a huge change again, bishops and religious orders working together. For over 20 years, they didn't do that before Francis.
Thanks, Rafael. There's a number of questions coming through. I might throw this one to Elissa. One of the comments was about the language we use, and a word like governance compared to something like structural participation. Elissa, would you like to respond to that question about language in church and how that might help us engage in the synodal process, particularly around that area of governance and participation, as they were the words that were brought up in this comment?
Sure, thanks, Tony. I see the comment, and I understand that structures of participation is a good vision to have to comprehend what we have in our parishes, in our dioceses. But the word governance, the whole concept behind it is still really important for us to explore in the church. Governance is a specialty, and my experience in the workplace has been that if you have skilled people in governance who know that they need certain skills, that they should be experts in the area of governance, and they can guide what comes from below and the interaction of what comes from below and what comes from above. I think that would be a real gift to the church if we accepted governance as a specialty. And it doesn't have to be a specialty owned by the bishops. In fact, from what I've seen, that the workplace is something that we can learn from in the church. And I'd point to religious orders, some of them who have quite advanced understandings of governance that is quite different to the church, and yet it's not a business or corporate understanding of governance, is certainly a resource that we should be looking at. That there are some who are really skilled in governance, and it would be a great gift for us to learn from them. So I find that in a diocese that doesn't have interaction with the religious world, it tends to be that the clerical structure, and then others who are sort of off in their own bubbles. I feel like there needs to be a coming together, and the governance is one of those areas. So I point again to the Health and Integrity in Church and Ministry Conference. Had some wonderful papers on governance, and a person like Susan Pascoe, if you listen to her, you'd think, yes, governance is important, but we need to change our perspective on its place. Almost, it's not theology. The theology of the episcopacy is not to keep governance to itself, but to allow it to flourish in the church. So I think we need to break open the stranglehold that we've traditionally had with governance. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Elissa. Thank you so much. Nancy, I wonder if I could bring you in. Somebody's asked a question about finance in the church, and that there is a culture, certainly here, about the finances are managed by the clerical cult, the clerical group, and that whole question about employing lay people, paying lay people a living wage for their contribution and leadership within the church. And I think some parts of America may be a bit ahead of us. We still struggle with little things like people say, oh, why do you have to pay the organist to play at Mass? Things like that. But would you like to make a comment on that area of finance and how that fits into this conversation about synodality?
Well, I think the whole question of finance is a little bit interesting, because those of us who work and care about justice in the workplace feel that our church probably is quite hypocritical because of the number of people who are employed by the church institutions and by so many of its services, and somehow don't seem to understand the reason why people want to organize and have a say in their jobs. So we have, lots of disgruntled employees, and we hear this often, who work for our churches. Some of them do get benefits, and but they're supposed to work for the love of God, and yet they're lay people working, and they have families to support, and they should have dignified jobs. There are some who are paid very well, but we have lots in many of the institutions who are not paid very well. But money is a big thing. We have a lot of things to support in the United States. We hear that all the time from the bishops, which is one reason why we're closing parishes and closing schools, because you have to go where the money is, and if you're in a poor community, you find that you don't share so well in the money that is raised. So a lot of the problems in the church in the United States, most of us lay people say, is the question of power and money, and we're subject to that. So, but there are those of us who are not happy with what's happening to employees of our churches, because again, they're not being treated according to the principles of justice for workers. And they are working people. And our clergy also, they're working people. And we've seen, some instances where at retirement, or go find yourself a place to live, they're sort of, priests are left out in the cold. Not in the orders, they're taken care of in the religious communities, but the secular priests sometimes are not really taken care of at the time of retirement. So the finance thing is something that we lay people don't have any control over, except what we put in the collection and our donations. But we have lots of questions about how the people who are working for the church are being treated.
Thank you very much, Elissa. That's relevant here in Australia as well. There's a number of questions coming through. One that's just come through, and I'd like to throw this to the three of you, is the question that brought up the whole issue of canon law. And it's come up as part of the plenary council about how the restrictions of canon law impact on decision-making within the plenary council. This particular comment, you will see, was brought in the context of the Tridentine culture that is still happening around a number of communities and dioceses. Rafael, would you like to start with that? How do we deal with this conflict between canon law and this understanding of synodality?
Yes, there are to be reforms, of course, in canon law, aligning the ecclesiology of the people of God with a canon, with the code of canon law. So this is one task and one challenge, how to align the ecclesiology of the people of God in terms of canon law. One of the things that at least a group of us are working is how to reconfigure councils, parish councils, presbyter councils, and diocesan pastoral councils, not only making them mandatory, but also in the way in which they should work, representing the whole people of God and the bishop making the decisions together in those bodies, ecclesial bodies. So I think that's one of the challenges, how to reform certain canons and create new ones, align them with the ecclesiology of the people of God. this is what our experience, at least in that we're working on in Latin America, in this alignment of the ecclesiology of the people of God and Canada.
Thanks, Rafael. Elissa, would you like to make a comment on this one?
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to say how exciting it is to have the thought that parish pastoral councils and different structures within the church can be have really strong guidelines behind them, because that can be some of the most painful experiences for lay people who are called to leadership and have those skills and those gifts for the church, that can very quickly be excluded from that within their own community. But I'd like to point to the ecclesial conference in Latin America as an example of creating a new body with new laws and standards for it, because as you said, that there's only 20% bishops participating in that, which is quite different to our other bodies, which have very strict rules about how many lay people can be involved. So I feel that the more we explore these our desire for participation and for diverse leadership within the church, the more we will see opportunities like that to create new bodies if our current bodies are not doing what we need them to do. Perhaps there are new ways of doing things. So for me, that's a really exciting development, is the ecclesial conference. So it's not the equivalent of the Synod of Bishops, it's the equivalent of our Australian Catholic Bishops Conference, which of course has only members who are bishops. So the thought that alongside that we could potentially have an ecclesial conference that has members who are bishops, but most of the members are the diversity of the church in Australia, that really excites me. So we're a long way from that in Australia, but I think we're on a journey. The more that we see the need for bodies like that, hopefully the closer we can get to that.
Thank you, Elissa. Thank you. Nancy, from the American experience, we read quite a lot in church media about the conflicts that's happening within the bishops' conference there, and the loud voices that seem to veer more towards a canonical model of church rather than a synodal model of church. Is that a fair comment from an outside observer?
I think it's very much a fair comment. We are totally separated, it seems. There's, I would say 75% of the bishops are in one place and 25% in another. So, and our Catholic population is pretty much the same. And so, yeah, we're not in a good place. And I actually, the whole synodal process was to begin. And from what I understand, well, we'll see this week. The bishops will be meeting this week in my diocese in Baltimore, and we'll see if they even talk about the Synod. I think they should have to, but their meeting 6 months ago, I think it was a couple bishops tried to bring it up that it was coming, and it never really was discussed. So we're waiting to see what happens this week, but we're very much divided.
Thank you, Nancy, and we will be following that meeting with great interest. Look, we've just noticed that our time is slipping away, and a few people are starting to move on. There's a lot in the chat room. Just to remind you that you can, and we will save a copy of the comments in the chat room that we will share with you, as well as Rafael's slideshow. And Stefan, I might hand back to you. We were hoping to have a conversation about action and the action steps. So do you want to say a little bit about that, Stefan, or is that perhaps something for a future gathering?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. Yeah, excuse me. I did think in the last days of preparation of this, it might be meaningful to try and see what personal actions we could take up for the future in relation to implementing synodality in Australia. Perhaps it's best that we take it as a personal challenge to be followed up in our thoughts over Christmas and the summer holidays in Australia, and something that we could come back to in the new year. I know that for myself personally, yeah, I've started to think of a lot of things that I'd kind of like to do, including writing at least a blog post, if not an article, about how Cardijn, what we can read from Cardijn about synodality, some of which we've already heard today. So I don't know. I think if we've had a lot of input, and it might be time to move to the close, so people can move on to their next events and sleep for some people in some parts of the world. So I'd just like to, in closing, make a small presentation to our three presenters today. I believe I was guided by the Holy Spirit. Tony, you might be able to show the slide of this. I was wondering what gift we could give to Rafael and Elissa and Nancy. And yesterday in the mail, I received from a South African Dominican, Father Joe Faulkner, the final print copies of his new book of memoirs, A Priest for Workers. It's the story of his life, really, as a Dominican priest, working in South Africa and Southern Africa, working in particular with young people, young Christian worker leaders, some of whom were imprisoned. You can even see one of them in the picture on the photo there, Pelele Magani, sadly no longer with us. Jonathan Williams was in the diocesan offices in Durban when the South African security forces bombed it. So it's really a kind of an incredible story of the work of the YCW and of a priest working with young lay people at the height of the apartheid era. So Rafael, Elissa, and Nancy, on behalf of the Australian Cardijn Institute, we'd like to present you with a copy of this. I will send you the virtual PDF, but also if you can send to me your physical addresses, we'd like to send you a copy of this book. And thank you for participating today and leaving us with so many challenges, which it's going to take us a long time to absorb and to implement.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you so much. May
Thank
I
you. Absolute pleasure.
say a comment?
Sure.
I don't want to give the impression that Latin American is perfect, the church there, here, but what I wanted to highlight in the presentation is that there are some experiences that come from the praxis. That's where Cardijn was so important for us, that then the praxis became the theology and it became a structure. And this way of proceeding is maybe what is typical from our church. It's not that we do better theology. That's not the point. We don't have a better church. It's the way in which we proceed to do things. And the most recent example is this ecclesial assembly. It began by a proposal that came from the Pan-Amazonian Synod, but it never was imagined at the beginning as an ecclesial conference. It was just a thought about an Episcopal conference following Aparecida, but they didn't want to do it exactly the same model of Episcopal conference. And after months of debate, then we figure out, okay, it should be an ecclesial, because then the bishops should not be majority, and we can include even 10% of agnostic, atheist, and social movements of the participants that will vote in the ecclesial assembly. So all this came through praxis and dialogue. And I am a lay person, and I work with the Confederation of Religious Men and Women and the bishops in Selam. And my experience is that at least we can sit and talk even if we do not agree. And that's something cultural. That's the point. It's cultural. So our church has become more cultural, and that has facilitated these things that I have been sharing. So it's not that we do not have clericalism, we have a lot of clericalism, we have a lot of hierarchalism, but there is a horizontal pastoral way of proceeding that does these changes now and then, here and there, no? So that's what I wanted to share. There is hope in all of our churches, and there is hope with this synod coming on process, and we don't have to lose hope right now in the church.
Thanks
Thank
very
you
much,
so much. Yeah.
Raphael. I think that's a great conclusion. Yeah. So look, would you like to say a final couple of words, Elissa or Nancy, just to send us on our way?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Stefan. And just great to see everybody here today. And I think just the example of the commitment and the length of the journey that they've had in Latin America, I think is a good sign of hope for us in Australia. So yeah, I encourage everybody to share this video. Perhaps you'll receive the recording of it, and keep thinking and keep praying and keep doing.
Thank you, Elissa. Nancy?
Yes, and I would just say the same thing. I do want to share the video with some of the people here in US who I think will get a great deal out of it. But I feel very hopeful, just knowing that we're in this process, and recognizing, you know, it's taken you a long time in Latin America to get where you are, and we won't do it overnight, but we've got to begin. And I think knowing that this is happening all over the world, we in the US will catch on, I think. We're working at it. So, but thank you very much for putting this together.
All right, and I'd just like to thank everybody for participating, that's joined. Thanks to Tony for his work. And again, once again, a final word of thanks to our speakers. And we'll see you all again in the next year with some new proposals and perhaps more action to take on the whole development of synodality. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cut the video.